The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Frank Martinez slowly pushed open the heavy glass door of Pete's Diner. The small bell above the door chimed softly, just as it had every morning for the past 15 years. At 93 years old, Frank moved carefully but with purpose, his wooden cane tapping gently against the worn tiles of the diner floor. "Good morning, Mr. Martinez." Sarah, the young waitress with kind eyes and a warm smile, called out from behind the counter. She was already pouring his regular order, black coffee in his favorite blue mug with a small chip on the handle. Frank had been using the same mug for so long that Pete, the diner's owner, had officially retired it from other customers' use. The old veteran made his way to his usual spot, a cozy corner booth with a clear view of both the street and the diner's entrance. Years of military training had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, a habit he never quite shook even decades after the war. The leather of the booth seat crackled softly as he settled in, placing his cane carefully against the wall. The early morning light filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Cedar Grove was just beginning to wake up. Frank watched as Mr. Thompson, the baker across the street, unlocked his shop door. A few cars passed by, their headlights still glowing in the dim morning light. Everything was exactly as it should be, just as it had been every morning. Sarah brought over his coffee and a menu, though they both knew he wouldn't need it. "The usual, Mr. Martinez?" she asked, her pen already poised over her notepad. Frank nodded with a gentle smile. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy hash browns. His breakfast hadn't changed in years. While waiting for his food, Frank pulled out his old leather wallet. Inside, behind his ID and a few wrinkled dollar bills, he kept a small black and white photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself in his military uniform, standing proud and tall. Sometimes, he could hardly believe that the strong young soldier in the photo was the same person he saw in the mirror now. The diner slowly began to fill with its regular morning crowd. There was Mary from the library, Tom the mailman, and a few factory workers grabbing coffee before their early shift. Frank knew them all, not by conversation. He was never much of a talker, but by 15 years of quiet observation from his corner booth. But lately, things had started to change. New faces had begun appearing at Pete's Diner. A group of bikers had discovered the place about 2 weeks ago, and they were getting bolder with each visit. They would roar up on their loud motorcycles, usually around 7:30 a.m., disrupting the peaceful morning atmosphere that Frank cherished. This morning was no different. Right on schedule, the rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air. Frank watched through the window as 5 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The riders were dressed in black leather jackets covered in patches and logos. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, always seemed to stare a little too long at Frank's corner booth. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she refilled Frank's coffee cup. He noticed how she and the other staff grew tense whenever the bikers arrived. Even Pete, who usually handled difficult customers with ease, seemed uncertain about this new group. Frank sipped his coffee quietly, watching as the bikers claimed their usual table, the one closest to his booth. Their loud laughter and rough language filled the once peaceful diner. He could feel their occasional glances in his direction, accompanied by snickers and whispered comments. But Frank Martinez hadn't survived 93 years, including a world war, by being easily intimidated. He continued his morning routine, methodically cutting his toast into precise triangles, just as he had done every morning for the past 15 years. The only sign that he noticed the bikers at all was the slightly tighter grip he kept on his cane, and the way his weathered eyes carefully tracked their movements in the reflection of the diner's window. Little did anyone know, this morning would mark the beginning of a story that would change everything at Pete's Diner. 2 weeks had passed since the bikers first started coming to Pete's Diner, and the peaceful morning atmosphere Frank Martinez had enjoyed for 15 years was slowly disappearing. The leader of the bikers, who everyone now knew as Rex, seemed to take special interest in making the old veteran uncomfortable. That morning started like any other, with Frank arriving at his usual time of 6:45 a.m., but something was different. As he approached the diner's entrance, he noticed his regular parking spot, the one Pete had unofficially reserved for him close to the door, was blocked by 3 motorcycles. Frank's arthritis was particularly bad that day, and the extra 30 yards he had to walk felt like miles. Sarah watched through the window, her face filled with concern as the old man made his slow journey from the far end of the parking lot. She already had his blue coffee mug ready when he finally pushed through the door, breathing harder than usual from the extended walk. "Those jerks," she whispered under her breath, seeing how Frank's hands shook slightly as he gripped his cane. "Mr. Martinez, I can talk to them about moving their bikes." Frank shook his head. "No need to cause trouble, Sarah," he said quietly, making his way to his corner booth. But today, there was another surprise waiting for him. Rex and two of his biker friends had pulled a chair up right next to Frank's usual table. "Hope you don't mind the company, old-timer," Rex said with a smirk, his leather jacket creaking as he leaned back in his chair. He was a large man, probably in his mid-40s, with a thick beard and arms covered in colorful tattoos. The skull ring on his right hand tapped against the table in an irritating rhythm. Frank settled into his booth silently, placing his cane against the wall as always. The morning sun caught the small military pin on his aged jacket, a detail that didn't escape Rex's notice. "Hey boys," Rex called out to his friends. "Looks like we got ourselves a real-life war hero here." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Tell us, Gramps, did you ride a dinosaur into battle?" The other bikers laughed, but Frank remained focused on stirring his coffee, adding his usual one sugar packet with steady hands. Years of military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure. Pete, the diner's owner, watched nervously from behind the counter. He was a big man himself, but Rex and his crew had started bringing more members each week. Today, there were 7 of them scattered around the diner, all wearing the same leather vests with their club's logo. The harassment continued through breakfast. When Sarah brought Frank's usual order, Rex knocked his elbow into the table, causing some coffee to spill on Frank's newspaper. "Oops," Rex said with fake concern. "Guess your hands aren't as steady as they used to be, old man." Other regular customers started avoiding their usual tables near Frank's booth. Mary from the library, who usually sat nearby and exchanged quiet nods with Frank, now chose a seat far across the room. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Tom, the mailman, tried to help one morning. "You folks might want to show some respect," he said to the bikers. "Mr. Martinez here is a veteran." Rex stood up slowly, his full height intimidating as he towered over Tom's smaller frame. "My tax dollars already paid for his medals. He doesn't need my respect, too." The other bikers laughed, and Tom quickly retreated to his seat. Frank continued his daily routine, but small changes were noticeable to those who knew him well. His visits became shorter. Sometimes his hands trembled slightly when reaching for his cane. The photograph of his younger self in uniform stayed in his wallet instead of making its usual appearance on the table. Sarah noticed how he would scan the parking lot before entering each morning, checking for the motorcycles. On days when the bikers were already there, she could see him take a deep breath before pushing open the door, squaring his shoulders just like he probably did all those years ago in the war. But something was building behind Frank's quiet exterior. Those who looked carefully might have noticed the way his eyes followed the bikers' movements, studying them, assessing them. There was a glint in those aged eyes that hinted at something more than just an old man's patience. The regulars at Pete's Diner could feel it. Something had to give. They just didn't know that tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The morning that changed everything at Pete's Diner started with dark clouds hanging low over Cedar Grove. Frank Martinez stood at the diner's entrance, his reflection faint in the glass door. Today was different. He was 15 minutes later than usual because of a doctor's appointment, and his joints ached more than normal from the coming rain. As he opened the door, the usual bell chime was drowned out by the loud laughter of Rex and his biker gang. They had taken over the center of the diner, pushing tables together to accommodate their growing numbers. Today, there were 9 of them, all wearing their black leather vests with patches. Sarah hurried over with Frank's blue coffee mug, her face showing worry. "Maybe today you'd like to sit at the counter, Mr. Martinez?" she whispered, noticing how Rex and his friends had spread out near Frank's usual corner booth. But Frank just shook his head slowly and made his way toward his regular spot. The wooden floorboards creaked under his careful steps as he navigated between tables with his cane. Just as he was about to reach his booth, Rex deliberately stretched out his long legs across the pathway, creating an obstacle. The other bikers watched with amused grins, expecting the old man to give up and find another seat. Instead, Frank politely said, "Excuse me, son." His voice was steady and clear, despite not having spoken yet that morning. Rex pretended not to hear him, continuing a loud conversation with his friends about their latest motorcycle rides. Frank stood patiently, one hand gripping his cane, the other holding onto a nearby chair for support. The diner had gone quiet, with other customers watching nervously. Even Pete had stopped wiping the counter, his hand frozen mid-wipe as he observed the scene. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, Frank spoke again. "Young man, I need to get to my seat." Rex turned slowly, a mocking smile on his face. "Oh, I'm sorry, Gramps. Are these old legs of mine in your way?" He stretched them out even further, causing some of his friends to snicker. What happened next shocked everyone in the diner. As Frank attempted to step over Rex's legs, Rex suddenly moved his feet, causing Frank's cane to slip on the smooth floor. The old veteran lost his balance, and his cane clattered to the ground. Frank didn't fall. Years of military training had taught him how to catch himself, but he stumbled noticeably. His coffee cup slipped from his hand, a hot liquid splashing across the floor. The sound of the cup hitting the tiles echoed through the now silent diner. Sarah gasped. Pete emerged from behind the counter, his face red with anger. But before anyone could react, Frank straightened himself up to his full height. For a moment, despite his age, everyone could see the soldier he once was. Then, he did something completely unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a frightened smile or an angry one. It was calm, confident, and somehow knowing. Frank bent down slowly and picked up his cane, then turned to Rex with the same steady smile. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent diner, "would you join me for a cup of coffee?" The request caught Rex completely off guard. He stared at Frank, trying to understand if this was some kind of joke. His friends looked equally confused, their usual smirks fading into uncertain expressions. "What did you say?" Rex asked, his voice losing some of its usual arrogance. "Coffee," Frank repeated, gesturing to his empty booth. "I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee and share a story with you, just you and me." The other customers watched in amazement. Sarah stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand. Pete had moved closer, ready to intervene if needed, but Frank raised his hand slightly, signaling him to wait. Rex looked at his friends, then back at Frank. The old veteran's calm demeanor and unexpected invitation had completely disrupted the usual pattern of intimidation. After what seemed like an eternity, curiosity got the better of Rex. "All right, old man," he said, standing up slowly. "This better be good." As Rex followed Frank to the booth, nobody in Pete's diner could have guessed that this simple invitation to coffee was about to reveal a secret that would change everything, especially the life of a tough biker who thought he had the upper hand. The tension in Pete's diner was thick as Frank Martinez and Rex sat across from each other in the corner booth. Sarah quickly brought 2 fresh cups of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she set them down. Rex's biker friends watched from their tables, unusually quiet, waiting to see what would happen next. Frank took his time, stirring his coffee with the same slow, deliberate movements he used every morning. The only sound was the gentle clinking of his spoon against the blue mug. Rex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not used to such silence. "You know," Frank began, his voice gentle but clear, "when I was about your age, I loved the sound of motorcycle engines too." He reached for his worn leather wallet, the same one he looked at every morning. But this time, instead of pulling out the military photo everyone was familiar with, he removed a different, more faded picture. Rex leaned forward to spike himself, curiosity getting the better of him. The photograph showed a group of young men standing proudly next to their motorcycles. The bikes were older models, clearly from decades ago, but what caught Rex's attention was the unmistakable logo on their leather jackets. "No way," Rex whispered, his tough guy act dropping for the first time. That's the original Hell's Angels patch." Frank nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "San Bernardino, California, 1948. His weathered finger pointed to a tall, handsome young man in the photo. "That's me, third from the left, one of the founding members." The coffee in Rex's cup had gone untouched, forgotten as he stared at the photograph. His hands, covered in tattoos and heavy rings, trembled slightly as Frank handed him the picture for a closer look. "I was fresh out of World War II, Frank continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's rhythm. "A lot of us veterans were looking for that same brotherhood we had in the service. The open road called to us, just like it calls to you young folks today. Rex studied the photo intently, his eyes wide with recognition. "This is Otto Friedli," he said, pointing to another man in the picture. "He's a legend. Every real biker knows about him." Then Rex looked up at Frank, real respect showing in his eyes for the first time. "You rode with Otto?" Frank reached into his wallet again and pulled out more photos. Each one was carefully preserved, showing young Frank with his motorcycle at different rallies and meets. The dates on the backs of the photos read like a history of motorcycle culture in America. By now, some of Rex's friends had drifted closer to the booth, drawn by their leader's obvious amazement. They crowded around, trying to get a look at the historical photos. The regular customers of Pete's Diner watched in astonishment as the previously intimidating bikers transformed into excited kids at a history museum. "That's my old 47 Knucklehead," Frank said, pointing to a particularly beautiful motorcycle in one photo. "Bought her with my service pay. Rode her across 48 states over the years." There was a touch of pride in his voice, mixed with a hint of sadness. "What happened to it?" Rex asked, genuinely interested. Frank's eyes grew distant for a moment. "Had to sell her 5 years ago. My Margaret. My wife. She got sick. Cancer. The bike helped pay for her treatment." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "Sometimes life makes you choose between the things you love and the people you love even more." The diner had grown so quiet you could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Rex's tough exterior had completely melted away. He looked at Frank with new eyes, seeing not just an old man, but a pioneer of the very culture he and his friends thought they owned. "Mr. Martinez," Rex said, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't know what to say. We've been real jerks to you." Frank just smiled and reached for the photos. "Life's too short for hard feelings, son. But maybe next time, you boys could leave that first parking spot open for these old legs of mine." The laughter that followed was genuine and warm, filling Pete's Diner with a new kind of energy. Sarah, watching from behind the counter, wiped away a tear as she saw the transformation taking place. Pete himself stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied smile on his face. But this was just the beginning. None of them could have guessed how this revelation would change not just the diner, but the entire town of Cedar Grove. News travels fast in the biker community, and the story of Frank Martinez spread like wildfire through Cedar Grove and beyond. Within just 3 days of his revelation at Pete's Diner, everything had changed. The small-town restaurant became an unexpected pilgrimage site for motorcycle enthusiasts from all over the state. It was 6:45 a.m., Frank's usual arrival time, when he noticed something different in the parking lot. Not only was his spot near the door empty, but someone had put up a handmade sign that read, "Reserved for Frank M., Original Angel." The sign was decorated with carefully painted motorcycle designs. As Frank made his way inside, he found Pete's Diner already buzzing with activity. But today, instead of the usual morning crowd, the place was filled with bikers of all ages. They weren't just Rex's group either. There were members from at least 5 different motorcycle clubs, easily identified by their various patches and colors. "Good morning, Mr. Martinez." Sarah called out cheerfully, already heading to his booth with his blue coffee mug. The path to his corner cleared immediately, with burly men in leather jackets stepping aside respectfully. Some even nodded and saluted, treating him like a military officer. Rex was there too, but his attitude had completely transformed. He stood up straight when Frank entered, quickly walking over to help the veteran with his jacket. "Mr. Martinez, sir," he said eagerly, "there are some people here who've been dying to meet you." Frank settled into his usual booth, but today it was different. Instead of sitting alone, he found himself surrounded by attentive faces. A gray-haired biker named Chuck, who had ridden 3 hours just to meet him, pulled out a motorcycle magazine from 1950. "Sir," Chuck said, his voice filled with awe, "is this you in this old rally photo?" He pointed to a group shot where a young Frank stood proudly next to his knucklehead. Frank nodded, and the magazine was passed around reverently among the gathered bikers. Sarah could barely keep up with the coffee orders as more motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot. By 8 a.m., the diner was packed, with riders sharing stories and asking Frank questions about the early days. The regular customers watched in amazement as the once intimidating bikers treated Frank like royalty. "Tell us about the first cross-country ride," one young rider called out. "Is it true you guys didn't even have proper highways back then?" Frank's eyes twinkled as he shared tales of riding across America in the late 1940s. He told them about sleeping under the stars, fixing motorcycles with whatever tools they could find, and the brotherhood that developed on those long rides. The bikers listened intently, hanging on every word. Pete had to call his wife to bring in extra coffee supplies from home. He'd never seen the diner so busy, and certainly never imagined it would become a gathering place for bikers from all over. But these weren't the intimidating troublemakers from before. They were respectful, eager to learn, and generous with their orders. Rex, who had appointed himself as Frank's unofficial assistant, kept the crowd organized and made sure nobody overwhelmed the old veteran. One at a time with the questions, guys, he'd say. Mr. Martinez needs to eat his breakfast too. Around mid-morning, a special visitor arrived. It was Tommy Chen, owner of the biggest motorcycle shop in the state. He pushed through the crowd to reach Frank's booth, carrying an old leather-bound photo album. Mr. Martinez, Tommy said, placing the album on the table, my father took these photos at the first West Coast motorcycle rally. He always told me about the veterans who started it all, but I never thought I'd meet one of the originals. As Frank carefully opened the album, the crowd gathered closer. There, preserved in black and white, was another piece of motorcycle history. Frank pointed out faces and shared stories about each photo, painting a vivid picture of a time when motorcycle culture was just beginning. Looking around the packed diner, Sarah couldn't help but smile. The same bikers who had been causing trouble just days ago were now protectively gathered around Frank, treating him like a treasured grandfather. Every time the door chime rang, it meant another rider had come to pay respects to the veteran who helped shake their culture. But the biggest surprise was still to come, as Rex and his friends had secretly set in motion a plan that would give Frank back something he thought he'd lost forever. A week had passed since Frank Martinez's revelation at Pete's Diner, and Rex couldn't shake off the guilt that kept him awake at night. The memory of how he had treated the elderly veteran haunted him, especially after learning about Frank's sacrifice, selling his beloved motorcycle to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. That morning, Rex arrived at the diner earlier than usual, before Frank's regular time. He had called an important meeting with his biker group, and they sat huddled around two pushed-together tables, speaking in hushed voices. Sarah watched them curiously as she set up for the morning rush, noticing how different they seemed from the troublemakers they'd been just days ago. Listen up, Rex said to his friends, spreading out a worn piece of paper on the table. I've been doing some research. Frank's old Harley, the 47 Knucklehead, was sold to a collector in the next state. I found out where it is. His fingers traced the address written on the paper. The other bikers leaned in closer, their coffee cups forgotten. Tommy Chen, the motorcycle shop owner who had become a regular visitor, joined their conversation. A 47 Knucklehead in good condition could cost upwards of $25,000 these days, he said quietly. Rex nodded, then pulled out his wallet and placed all the cash he had on the table. I'm putting in everything I got. Who's with me? One by one, the bikers reached for their wallets. Even Sarah walked over and placed her tip money from the past week on the growing pile. Pete emerged from the kitchen and added a substantial amount, saying gruffly, "It's for Frank." The diner's door chime rang, and everyone quickly gathered up the money as Frank made his way to his usual booth. He noticed the unusual gathering but didn't say anything, simply nodding good morning to everyone as he passed. Over the next few days, news of the plan spread through the biker community. Motorcycle clubs from neighboring towns started sending contributions. Local businesses, touched by Frank's story, added to the fund. Children brought their piggy banks to the diner, wanting to help the veteran who had become a local hero. Rex spent his evenings on the phone, negotiating with the collector who owned Frank's old motorcycle. He learned that the bike had been well maintained, still in beautiful condition. The collector, after hearing Frank's story, agreed to sell it back for a fair price. One morning, as Frank sat drinking his coffee and sharing stories with his new friends, his eyes fell on a familiar face in one of his old photographs. "That's my Margaret," he said softly, pointing to a beautiful young woman sitting on the back of his knucklehead. "She loved riding almost as much as I did." Rex, who was sitting nearby, noticed how Frank's hand trembled slightly as he touched the photograph. The old veteran continued, "You know, selling that bike was the easiest hard decision I ever made. Margaret needed those treatments, and I'd have sold everything I owned to help her." The words hit Rex hard. He thought about his own grandfather, who had passed away the previous year. How many times had he promised to visit but never made it? How many stories had he missed hearing because he thought he was too busy? Later that evening, after Frank had gone home, Rex gathered everyone at the diner again. The final count of their collection was done, and they were still short of their goal. Without hesitation, Rex walked out to the parking lot, stood next to his prized custom motorcycle, and said, "I'm selling my bike. This needs to happen." Other bikers stepped forward, offering to sell their extra parts and gear. Tommy Chen promised to handle all future maintenance on Frank's motorcycle for free. Local mechanics volunteered to help with the restoration if needed. Pete watched all this from behind his counter, amazed at how one man's story had transformed not just the troublemakers who used to harass him, but the entire community. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was now a place where redemption and friendship flourished. As they finalized their plans for the surprise, none of them could wait to see Frank's face when they revealed what they had done. But first, they had one more important task: bringing home a very special motorcycle that hadn't been seen in Cedar Grove for 5 years. On a bright Saturday morning, Pete's diner was unusually quiet. The CLOSDDFR Private EVENT sign hung on the door, but inside, dozens of people worked quietly, preparing for something special. Sarah hung red, white, and blue streamers while Pete arranged extra chairs and tables. Rex and his biker friends kept glancing nervously at the clock. "You'll be here in 30 minutes, Sarah announced, checking her phone. She had arranged for Frank's grandson to bring him to the diner, telling him there was a small problem with his regular booth that needed his opinion. In the parking lot, covered by a large tarp, stood Frank's original 1947 Harley-Davidson Knucklehead. Rex and Tommy Chen had driven through the night to pick it up from the collector. The motorcycle looked even better than they remembered from the old photographs, its chrome gleaming, its leather seat carefully restored. "Everything has to be perfect," Rex muttered, adjusting the big red bow they had placed on the motorcycle's handlebar. His hands were still stained with grease from spending the entire night polishing every inch of the bike. People began arriving quietly through the back door. There were veterans from the local VFW post, wearing their service caps. Bikers from 5 different states stood in their club jackets, patches showing their respect for the occasion. Even the mayor had come, holding an official proclamation in her hands. Tommy Chen's daughter, Jenny, set up a projector and screen. She had created a slideshow of Frank's old photographs, mixed with pictures from the recent weeks at the diner. The transformation from tension to friendship was clear in the images. At exactly 6:45 a.m., Frank's grandson's car pulled into the parking lot. Through the diner's windows, everyone could see Frank using his cane, moving slowly toward the entrance. Rex quickly checked that the tarp was secure over the motorcycle one last time. The bell above the door chimed. Surprise! The crowd's cheer was deafening. Frank stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening at the sight of the packed diner. Sarah quickly brought him his blue coffee mug, helping him steady himself. "What's all this about?" Frank asked, clearly overwhelmed by the gathering. His grandson guided him to his usual booth, which had been decorated with military service flags and motorcycle memorabilia. Rex stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. The tough biker who had once intimidated everyone now looked like a shy schoolboy. "Mr. Martinez," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "we have something to tell you and something to show you." The mayor spoke first, reading a proclamation declaring the day Frank Martinez Day in Cedar Grove. The VFW commander presented Frank with a special recognition for his service, but these were just the opening acts. Jenny started the slideshow, and Frank watched with tears in his eyes as images from his past and present filled the screen. There he was as a young soldier, then as a founding member of the Hells Angels, and finally as the beloved regular at Pete's Diner. "But that's not all," Rex said, his voice stronger now. He nodded to his friends, who opened the diner's doors wide. 2 bikers carefully removed the tarp outside, revealing the gleaming knucklehead. Frank's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. That's impossible," he whispered. Rex knelt beside Frank's booth. "We found her, sir. The exact same bike you sold 5 years ago. Everyone in town helped. Bikers, businesses, kids with their allowance money. Even Pete sold his prized fishing boat." Tommy Chen added, "She's been fully restored, every part original or period correct. And she's yours again, Mr. Martinez, where she belongs." Frank slowly stood up, his cane forgotten as he made his way to the door. The crowd parted, creating a path. Outside, the morning sun caught the chrome of his beloved motorcycle, making it shine like new. His hands trembled as he touched the familiar handlebars. "Margaret always loved this bike," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She used to say it was the wings to our adventures." Rex pressed the key into Frank's hand. "Sir, would you consider taking her for a ride? With us as your escort?" Frank looked around at the gathered crowd, the bikers who had become family, the townspeople who had helped make this miracle happen, the veterans who shared his history. His eyes were wet with tears, but his smile was as bright as the morning sun. "Well," he said, pocketing his cane and swinging his leg over the familiar leather seat, "I suppose this old angel has one more ride left in him." The roar of dozens of motorcycles filled the air as Frank Martinez led a parade through Cedar Grove, proving that it's never too late for miracles, redemption, and new beginnings. 3 months had passed since that emotional morning when Frank Martinez was reunited with his beloved Harley Davidson. Pete's Diner had transformed into something nobody could have imagined. The small-town restaurant had become a gathering place where leather-clad bikers sat alongside veterans, business people, and families, all brought together by one man's remarkable story. It was Sunday morning, and the parking lot was filled with motorcycles of all kinds, from vintage classics to modern cruisers. Frank's knucklehead occupied its special spot near the door, now with a permanent brass plaque that read, "Reserved for Frank Martinez, Original Angel, American Hero." Inside, the diner had changed too. Pete had expanded the space, knocking down a wall to add what everyone now called the Angel's Corner. The walls were decorated with Frank's photographs, motorcycle memorabilia, and military honors. Display cases held pieces of biker history, carefully labeled and maintained. Frank sat in his usual booth, but he was no longer alone. Every Sunday, bikers would come from miles around for what they called wisdom and waffles. Young riders would gather around him, eager to learn from his stories and experience. "Tell us again about the cross-country ride of '49, a young woman biker named Maria asked, her eyes bright with interest. She had started riding just 6 months ago and never missed a Sunday at Pete's. Rex, who had become like a son to Frank, sat nearby managing the crowd. The former troublemaker was now the diner's unofficial sergeant-at-arms, making sure everyone got their chance to talk with Frank while ensuring the old veteran didn't get too tired. Sarah moved efficiently between tables, wearing a new uniform with a small motorcycle pin, a gift from the bikers who had become her regular customers. The once nervous waitress now knew every rider by name and their preferred breakfast orders. "You know what's amazing?" Pete said to his wife as they watched from behind the counter. "Our business has tripled, but we haven't had a single fight or problem since that day. These bikers are the most respectful customers we've ever had." The door chimed, and everyone looked up to see Tommy Chen entering with a special guest, a documentary filmmaker from the History Channel. They had heard about Frank's story and wanted to include him in a series about American motorcycle culture. But Frank just smiled and shook his head at the camera crew. "The real story," he said, gesturing to the packed diner, "is right here. It's about how people can change, how mistakes can turn into miracles, and how it's never too late to make things right." Rex nodded in agreement, remembering how he had once terrorized this same old man who now felt like family. Every Sunday, he rode beside Frank, watching proudly as the 93-year-old veteran handled his knucklehead with the skill of a rider half his age. The diner had also started a new tradition. Once a month, they hosted Veterans and Villains Day, where local veterans could come and share their stories with the biker community. The event always ended with a group ride to the Veterans Memorial, led by Frank on his restored motorcycle. Mr. Martinez called out Billy, a teenage boy who dreamed of getting his first motorcycle. "My grandfather was also in World War II. Could I bring him next Sunday?" Frank's eyes sparkled. "Son, this place is for everyone who believes in second chances and respect. Bring him by, we'll save a special seat." As the morning sun streamed through the windows, Frank looked around at what his corner booth had become. Children drew pictures of motorcycles at nearby tables, while their parents chatted with tattooed bikers about family and life. Veterans shared war stories with young riders, bridging generations through understanding and respect. The blue coffee mug, now officially retired and bronzed, sat in a place of honor above the booth. Below it was a simple plaque that read, "Sometimes angels come disguised as old men with stories to tell." When asked about the amazing changes at Pete's Diner, Frank would just smile and say, "Life's greatest blessings often come roaring up on two wheels, especially when you least expect them." And so, every Sunday morning in Cedar Grove, the sound of motorcycles signals not trouble, but the gathering of an unlikely family, brought together by an old veteran who proved that it's never too late for forgiveness, friendship, and one more ride.